nuances you see when you get up close. You miss some of the details. You don't hear some of the things you need to hear to actually make a good decision. Distance will create bad outcomes. And the first thing we've got to do is actually get proximate to the people we care about. You care about what's going on in poor schools, you've got to get inside those schools. You want to worry about what's going on in parts of the city where there's a lot of despair and frustration and hopelessness. You've got to get closer to those parts of our cities. Many of us have shaped our lives by creating enough distance from problems that we feel better. And I understand that, I do. But I'm persuaded if we're going to create a better Cleveland, we're going to create a better America, we've actually got to choose to get proximate to the things that matter. I'm a product of someone else's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children could not go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. And in my county, there wasn't a high school. My dad couldn't go to high school in the county because there was no high school for black kids. And then lawyers came into our community in the mid-1960s, and they insisted that my community comply with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And because these lawyers chose to get proximate to kids like me, poor, racially segregated area, I got to go to public school. I got to go to high school. Their choice to get proximate put me on a path that allows me to be here today. But for their decision to get proximate, I wouldn't be standing here. But because they did it, I got to go to high school, and I finished high school, and I got to go to college. I had a great time in college. I'm glad I'm on a college campus. I loved my time in college. I was able to play sports. I was very active in sports. I was very interested in music. I came from a very musical family, so I got to do a lot of music. And I studied. I was a philosophy major. And I had the time of my life in college. You know, I would go around and I would tell my friends, I said, I'm going to go outside, and I'm going to sit on the hillside, and I'm going to do some philosophy. And my friends would look at me, and now I realize that they would give me a smile because they thought I was saying I was going to go do drugs or something illegal like that. But I wasn't. I was really just sitting out on the hill, and I thought I was thinking the deepest thoughts that had ever been thought before. And then when I was a senior, one day somebody came up to me and they said, now what are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a really hostile question because it had never occurred to me until then that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And so I frantically started looking for ways to extend my education. And you high school students, I'll give you some advice. I didn't realize this, but if you're interested in doing graduate work in history or English or political science or psychology or any of those areas, you actually have to know something about history, English, and political science in college. I didn't realize that until I applied to graduate school. And so I was really desperate, and I was frantically trying to find a way to extend my education, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. Because it was really clear that you don't need to know anything. And so that's what I signed up for. I said, I'm going to law school. And sure enough, 3 months later, I found myself at Harvard Law School. And I was sitting in the classroom, and I woke up one morning and I thought, you know what, I've made a terrible mistake. I went to law school because I was interested in racial justice. I was interested in talking about poverty. I was interested in talking about justice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race. It didn't seem like anybody was talking about poverty. It didn't even seem like anybody was talking about justice. And I found it really alienating. And I decided this isn't for me. If this is what lawyers do, then I don't want this. And I left the law school after my first year, and I decided to go to the School of Government, Harvard School of Government, Kennedy School of Government. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll go into public policy. And 3 months into my year at the Kennedy School, the School of Government, I got up one morning and I sat down and I had a really honest conversation with myself, and I realized, gosh, I'm even more miserable here than I was in law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. And I found it alienating. And so I went back to the law school, and I was honestly trying to reconcile myself to a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be fully engaging. I was trying to make peace with that. And then I took a course that required me to spend a month working with a human rights organization in Georgia providing legal services to death row. I didn't realize it at the time, but the course required me to get proximate. And I went to Atlanta, Georgia, and I found this community of lawyers representing people on death row, and these people were fully plugged in. They got up early and they worked hard. They stayed up late and they seemed animated by the work they were doing. They seemed energized and engaged, and they were committed and passionate, and they were worried, but they were excited about the possibilities that they might make a difference in the lives of people. And finally I thought, wow, this is a different community than I've met before. I'd been there a week, and Director Steve Bright came to me one day and said, well, we need you to go to death row and go meet somebody we haven't had time to meet. We want you to go down there and explain to this man that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. So I was kind of nervous but excited, and I came to the office the next day and said, well, I'm ready to go to death row. Which lawyers are going to come with me? I said, well, we don't have time to spare a lawyer. That's why we decided. And all of a sudden I was terrified. I got in my car and I drove down there, and I was persuaded this man was going to be so disappointed. I was just a law student. And I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say to him when I got there, and I kept rehearsing in my mind, but when I parked my car and I got out of it, I immediately was overwhelmed. It was this intimidating place. It was called the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Center, which was a fancy name, but it was death row. When I went inside, the halls were dark and dingy, and the bars were clanging, and the officers were very unfriendly, and they took me back to this little room where I was waiting for this man to come inside, and I was pacing back and forth waiting for the man to come inside. And I was just getting more and more nervous, and finally, after 10 minutes of waiting, they opened the door. And on the other side of the door was this man just burdened with chains. That was the first thing I recognized about him. He was just weighed down with chains. He had handcuffs on his wrists, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles. And I stood there watching him. And it took the guards like 10 minutes to get the chains off of him, and the longer it took them to unchain him, the more nervous and anxious I became. And finally, they got the chains off of this man, and he walked inside, and at this point I was so nervous and I was so overwhelmed, I just walked up to the man and I said, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal law. I don't know anything about the appeals process. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. I don't know anything about habeas corpus. But they told me that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And when I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And he said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. The man grabbed my hand. And he says, I cannot tell you how grateful I am you're here. He said, you're the first person I've talked to in the last 2 years who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard. He says, I'm so excited by what you've told me. He says, now I'm going to see my wife and children. I've been talking to my wife, I've been talking to my kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now I'm going to see my wife. Now I'm going to see my children. Thank you, thank you, thank you. He gave me a hug. Couldn't believe it. We sat down and started talking. We had this amazing conversation. He was exactly my age. Same month, same day, same year. And he started asking me questions about my life, and I asked him questions about his life, and we got lost in conversation. And 15 minutes turned into an hour turned into 2 hours, 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. And I'd forgotten that I'd only scheduled to be there for 1 hour. And the guards were sitting outside the door, and they were angry that I was still inside. And after 3 hours, these guards came bursting into the room. And they couldn't do anything to me. They couldn't say anything to me, but they took it out on this man. They started throwing him against the wall, putting the chains back on him. I tried to get them to be calm, but they were ignoring me. And they put the handcuffs on his wrists, and they put them on so tightly I could see him grimacing. I said, no, that's too tight. They were paying me no mind. They threw him against the wall and wrapped the chain around his waist, and I was trying to get them to be calmer, to be gentle, but they would pay me no mind. And the man looked at me, he said, Bryan, don't you worry about this, you just come back. They put the shackles on his ankles, and I could see him grimacing. I tried to get him to stop, and the man looked at me again, he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, just come back. They started pushing this man toward the doorway. They were pushing him roughly. And I watched them push him toward the doorway, but when he got in front of the doorway, I saw him plant his feet. And just before they could push him out of the room, when they pushed him this last time, he didn't move. He just swayed a little bit, but he didn't move. And then this man looked at me. He said, Bryan, don't you worry about this. You just come back. And then I watched this man do something I never imagined I'd see. This man stood there, and he closed his eyes, and he threw his head back, and he started to sing. He had this big, beautiful, powerful voice. And he started singing this hymn I hadn't heard in a long time. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. The guards stopped moving, everybody stopped moving, and he kept singing. Then the guards recovered, and they started pushing him down the hallway. And you could hear these chains clanging down the hallway, but you could also hear this man singing about higher ground. I don't know what I expected to find on death row, but I did not expect to find that. I didn't expect to hear some condemned person sing to me. I didn't expect to see that kind of dignity. I didn't expect to see that kind of humanity. I didn't expect to see that kind of beauty. Being proximate actually allowed me to recognize the capacity for something redemptive in a place of darkness, devoid of hope. And it changed my orientation. All of a sudden, I knew that I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But not only did I know that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. That if I wanted to get to higher ground, I had to do something to help him get to higher ground. And it radicalized my interest in the study of law. I got back to Harvard Law School, and you could not get me out of the Harvard Law School library. Because I needed to know everything about federalism and civil procedure and constitutional law and criminal procedure and appellate courts and comedy and all of these things. I needed to know it all because I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. And that's what proximity will do. It will potentially allow you to help somebody else, but it will also help you to help yourself recognize the things that matter. When I graduated, I had no questions about what I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to that organization and stand with condemned people. And for the last 30 years, I've been providing legal services to people on death row because for me, it is about getting to higher ground. I want it for them, I want it for myself, I want it for all of us. And proximity will have this way of waking things up in you that you don't